The NFL is never short of interesting storylines. Whether it's on-field action or off-the-field drama, the NFL manages to hold people's attention year-round. This year, these storylines haven't been limited to the players or the teams, but have actually turned to the field itself. Several prominent NFL players have come out against artificial turf, saying that the artificial turf fields result in more injuries to players than the natural grass surfaces. While OBJ and Aaron Rodgers really started this movement, Nick Bosa recently came out with perhaps the most extreme comments about artificial turf. Nick Bosa said he notices a difference on a day-to-day basis and that other players agree with him. He also said that there is a 100% chance that this will affect where players sign in the future, based on if their team plays on artificial turf or natural grass. Then, adding fuel to this fire, when FIFA comes to North America for the 2026 World Cup, they're going to convert some of these turf surfaces to natural grass in order to accommodate FIFA's rules. As of right now, 16 out of the 32 NFL teams play their home games on artificial turf surfaces. While the players' comments are interesting, I wanted to take a look at the research and see what that says about artificial turf versus natural grass and the injuries that result. In this video, I'm going to take this opportunity to look at a systematic review research article about artificial turf versus natural grass and injury rates in athletes. So here's the article that was published in Team Physicians Corner. It's called Lower Extremity Injury Rates on Artificial Turf versus Natural Grass Playing Surfaces, and it's a systematic review. So in order to give the general findings up front, I'm going to look at the results section down in the abstract. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that they were unable to combine the data from the different research studies in order to make it one big data pool, and that's because of the differences between the studies. So instead, they characterized each article as having grass resulting in more injuries, turf resulting in more injuries, or the injury rates being equivalent between the two surfaces. This is why you'll hear the authors say things like the majority of the articles or most of the articles. So right off the bat, it seems like most studies on new generation turf found similar overall injury rates between the playing surfaces. But when you dug down deeper into the types of injuries, there was a higher foot and ankle injury rate on artificial turf compared with natural grass. Even further, and perhaps more interesting to us, similar knee and hip injury rates were reported between playing surfaces for soccer athletes on new generation turf, but football players, particularly those at high levels of competition, were more likely to sustain a knee injury on artificial turf than on natural grass. So these are really interesting results, but now I want to dig down into the article and see how they got to these conclusions. So for those who don't know, a systematic review takes the literature that's available, screens through it through a certain process that's meant to be unbiased, and then puts all of those results together in order to come to a general consensus. And the first part I want to focus on here is figure 1, because this gives a visual example of how they went through and did this. As you can see up here at the top left, through the search they had 1,433 articles. They went through, they screened the abstract to see which ones actually fit, and as a result they had 108 articles that they deemed possibly eligible. Through that, they then excluded 55 of those, and they ended up with 53 total articles to include in the study. So that's how they got the 53 articles. But what did those 53 articles actually show? For that, I'm actually going to go to their result figures because I think the charts do a better job visualizing the example than the words. Since this video is going to primarily focus on NFL players and injury rates in football, I'm going to focus on figure 4 and figure 5. So figure 4 shows the study outcomes categorized by sport. As you can see in the top left here, it has 3 main outcomes which I discussed earlier, that being turf causes more injuries, grass causes more injuries, and injury rates are equal. The turf causing more injuries is the green square. And as we go through this, we see that for football players, which is this column, the overall injury rates were shown to be higher in turf in the majority of the articles. The foot and ankle injury rates were shown to be higher in turf in the majority of articles, and the knee injury rates were shown to be higher in turf in the majority of the articles. Now, when you compare this with soccer in this column, you see that the majority of the articles in all three of those categories, and then the fourth category of hip injuries, had injury rates that were equal on turf versus natural grass. Now let's look at Figure 5. Figure 5 splits this up by professional athletes and amateur athletes. As you can see here, the only one that it was higher, and the majority of articles showed that turf caused more injury, was in foot and ankle in professional athletes. Otherwise, the injury rates were equivalent for all the other categories. With that being said, this doesn't separate football players from soccer players though. It just lumps all the professional athletes together. Now, ideally, we would have a table that showed professional football players versus amateur football players, and that would help us understand if these elite level athletes are at a higher risk of injury on turf. The authors didn't include a table about this, but they did talk about it in the discussion. So I'm going to go to that paragraph. So this paragraph right here is a little lengthy and gets a bit wordy, but I want you to hang in there with me. Interestingly, all three of the articles reporting a higher knee injury rate on new generation artificial turf were conducted among football players at the collegiate or professional level, suggesting that there may be unique factors in the elite football population that predispose these athletes to a higher risk of knee injuries on artificial turf compared with natural grass. These findings correspond with the result of a previous systematic review that reported a higher risk of anterior cruciate ligament ruptures, ACL injuries, on artificial turf for football players, but not for soccer players. Taken together, the whole body of relevant literature suggests that the risk of knee injuries is similar on artificial turf and natural grass for most athletes, but that football players, particularly those at high levels of competition, may be more likely to sustain a knee injury on artificial turf than natural grass. Now, before we draw too many conclusions about what they said here, we have to talk about the limitations of the study and the potential bias that exists. First, turf fields and grass fields vary in their quality. Everybody understands that grass fields that professional football teams play on are better than the typical Pop Warner youth football fields. There's also variability in turf fields as well. There's a bunch of different brands and they all propose that theirs is the best, but the quality varies of the turf surface. The authors actually discuss this, saying that the new generation turf, that being after the 1990s, is better for athletes, and the original generations of turf actually led to significantly more injuries. Second, we need to talk about the potential biases. 3 of these articles were sponsored by the artificial turf industry, and all 3 of those articles showed that grass caused more injuries than artificial turf. Third, they looked at a specific type of injury here. So they had an overall injury rate, but they also focused on the lower extremity injuries. They didn't focus and divide into groups like concussion, and they also couldn't account for long-term type injuries, say athletes that go on to develop arthritis. So what does this mean for turf fields in the NFL? Currently, it looks like for NFL players, knee injuries like the ACL tears, which are particularly devastating, are more likely to happen on turf fields than on natural grass surfaces. I think that as the evidence grows here, this will give the NFL Players Association and the Players Union more leverage when doing the collective bargaining agreement in order to get rid of turf fields and have all their surfaces be natural grass. That being said, the owners are going to try to keep the turf fields and argue that the improvements in the quality of turf can make them as good as grass. The reason for this is that the turf is easier to maintain, and it's also easier to convert into other surfaces whenever they're having other events at the stadium. So in summary, I think if you're an amateur athlete, you shouldn't be concerned about whether you play on turf versus grass, especially considering how poor some of the grass fields are maintained. Instead, you should focus on injury prevention. These are things like stretching, plyometrics, and sport-specific exercise in order to prevent these injuries in the future. Finally, I'd like you to check out my other video on ACL injuries. I'll link it above. There's more discussion on turf there as well. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you next time.